Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have David Jensen with me again. Welcome, David.
Good morning, Jay.
Good to have you again to go over the metals markets, the precious metals markets, and the strange things that are going on in this market, for sure, in these various markets, I should say. We like to every week sort of look at the premium price that's being paid in Asia, where there is more of a bullion market, a real honest-to-goodness physical market, as opposed to what is increasingly a fraudulent paper market in London and the United States. So let's go over those. Gold seems as though with a 0.1% premium, which has been pretty steady for a while, I guess. It's the one with the lowest premium.
Yes, that's right. And I think the one that is elevated is the silver on the Shanghai Gold Exchange at 13.1% versus the London price. Palladium, platinum, gold are all down slightly, 15.9% for palladium versus 18.2% 2 weeks ago, the last time we posted, and then platinum is now 6.4, down from 7.4. So, the reason I post these numbers is to keep track of the relative price of physical metal versus the London metal pricing. And I think the key here is that I really look at the pricing mechanism in New York and London as theater for the masses, and it's a distraction. And we know because of the size of the imbalances that we're facing that we're going to have a much higher price in the future, and that's what we're doing by posting these physical prices.
So it's a bit of a propaganda ploy, perhaps, to keep Americans, Westerners, disinterested in gold. If it isn't moving, there's no reason to own it. You just keep your trust in paper, I guess. Yeah,
we have unsound currencies, and because of the interventions over the last several years, or last couple of decades, really, the progressively increased interventions in the markets, we now have unsound markets. And so what we're doing is just tracking the physical metal prices here relative to the paper prices, and looking for that sign of a disconnect, signaling the precipitous move higher in prices is coming.
So let me understand and make sure that new listeners to this show might understand what we're talking about. It is really, what you're saying is that the Western markets, the London and New York markets in precious metals, are manipulated or artificially low, and the markets in Asia are where there's real physical trade is higher. But it just, how can you explain that continues to go on, though, David? Just because the manipulation continues to go on in the West?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
So why does this persist? I know the premiums have come down. The premium has come down from last week, as you just pointed out. But nonetheless, they're very substantial, except for gold. They're very substantial premia for these different markets. How do you explain? Is it just this whole notion that perpetual manipulation?
Well, there's enough physical metal to feed the Asian markets, but there's not enough to feed the Asian and the Western markets. And I think that what we're doing is that, and what's been done over a series of decades is move the West away from unsound money into a virtual system which is centrally planned and centrally controlled.
So the notion then is just to keep people disinterested, essentially, and not believing, and actually believing that gold is a barbaric relic, as Keynes suggested many years ago. So we've had this, in your notes to me today, you say that you don't really think, or that you think that really investors ought to just simply ignore these markets then. Explain why that's the case.
Well, it's basically a virtual metal being traded for virtual currency. And as a consequence, it can be any price on a week-to-week basis. It's 1,200, it's 1,300. Those numbers to me are really irrelevant if you look at the big picture, in that the markets have basically been broken, and what they're trading now is not the actual metal. They're trading virtual products. And we're looking for the East, where in Asia and in India and other places where there's very, very substantial demand to signal that the market is breaking down. We know that when you have price controls, which is what we have,
Right.
when you create metal from nothing and dilute the demand, the apparent demand for metal by creating non-existent metal and filling positions with it, when you have price controls, you always end up with empty shelves, and that's the breaking point that we're looking for, is that there's empty shelves.
All right. So if we start to see these spreads really breaking out big
Yeah.
time, then we'll know something is really we're at that breaking point.
Yes.
David, of course, what this is allowed to do, and it accelerated after 1971 when Nixon took us off the gold standard, was to the international gold standard, I should say. We were taken off our gold standard in the 1930s by Roosevelt, but what it allowed the banks to do then is to create enormous amounts of paper money. And you have a very interesting quote. I know you passed this along to our listeners before, but from John Exter warning us about what was going to happen. Pass that thought along from John Exter to our listeners.
Yeah, it's just as a foundation for our discovery, because it really resonated with me. But John Exter, who was of the Federal Reserve's Board of Governors and a very accomplished person and extremely acute thinker, he said, the marketplace is a crime and punishment world, and this Federal Reserve credit expansion is the greatest monetary crime of all time. Accordingly, the punishment will be far and away the greatest punishment of all time. And I think that is the context for the era that we're dealing with now. It's not looking for quick flips to make money, but it's to really buttress your position for a massive change in the world's markets and the world's monetary system, which is inevitable now because of the sequence of bubbles that have been really fomented and really engineered by London and by New York financial markets.
You also mentioned to me in your notes to me Ferdinand Lipp's book Cold Wars. When did he publish that book? It's quite a few years ago, no?
Yeah, I think it's about a decade ago. Gold Wars, he documented the battle against sound money continually by the banking sectors over the decades and centuries. And it really, having come from being a banker for the Rothschilds syndicate, and then breaking away from that, and then really realizing the injustice of what went on, and really how unbalanced and destabilizing it is to manipulate gold and to not use it as a monetary metal for the stable footing that it gives to the economy. He became a sound money advocate, and he identified this J. Aaron and Company intervening in the gold markets by really pressuring and inciting the central banks to lease gold out into the market, to create a silent supply of physical metal out into the market. And he really identified J. Aaron and Company at the center of this. And J. Aaron, of course, was bought in 1981 by Goldman Sachs. And now, I guess to tie this full circle, we just had last week the New York Fed whistleblower Carmen Segura coming out and indicating that the New York Fed was unwilling really to play any regulatory role of meeting with Goldman Sachs.
So the Fed is pretending to be our great regulator, our great savior, and in fact, pretty much like the fox guarding the chicken coop, I would say in many ways, because who owns the Fed is the next part of this story. The Federal Reserve is owned by the banks. Right. The Federal Reserve is not the ultimate entity. The Federal Reserve is a creature that was created on Jekyll Island, as we've heard on this show before, with Ed Griffin, the author of that book, and it was created by the bankers for the bankers. Of course, they pretend to be looking out after our interests. Quite something quite different, obviously. And Carmen Segura, she was not allowed or is not allowed to say much about what was going on, apparently.
Yeah, she had 45 hours of tape-recorded discussions, and I mean, she looked sincerely upon her job at the New York Fed as being one of oversight and regulation. And a couple of things stood out from those tapes. Was one, that the comment by the Goldman banker saying that once clients are wealthy enough, certain consumer laws don't apply to them. And then another New York Fed official telling Carmen thereafter that you didn't hear that. And then she really was pointing out that Goldman Sachs had no conflict of interest policy and was repeatedly pressured by other New York Fed officials not to document this in a report. And I think that the thing that stands out and is quite paradoxical, and I find it personally amusing, is that, you know, it's the New York Fed that has no conflict of interest policy, because it is the regulator, and it's taking on the impossible task of regulating its own shareholders.
Yeah.
How can you possibly have any kind of objective oversight? And you know, the New York Fed is continually, and the Federal Reserve for that matter too, operates in an opaque manner. It won't reveal who its shareholders are and the size of its shareholdings, and so, you know, the system as it's designed is one that's designed to be controlled by those who are supposed to be having the oversight by the regulators themselves.
Wow, it's just it's very disturbing. I must say, nothing new to people in this show, but it just keeps coming at you. And actually, Carmen Segarra was that was something very recent, right? It just came out this last weekend or sometime.
Yeah, last Friday on the 26th.
And where can people just possibly Google Carmen Segarra and find it that way?
Yeah.
This video that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's an
audio
1 hour audio show. Yeah, her
okay.
last name is Segarra. It was posted on an article about it was posted on Zero Hedge, but there's actually a 1 hour show on the analysis of the tapes that's available on the web.
Very interesting. You know, it's interesting how from time to time whistleblowers and people come out from within, from the inside. They tell us what's going on, but I guess it's just too threatening for people to really to really do much about it. And I guess, you know, I mean, nobody's paying too much attention. As long as the mainstream media can keep it from becoming news, the mainstream media decides what is news and what is not news to a great extent. So
that's right.
By you know, just by simply ignoring certain things, you can control the way people think and how they behave.
That's correct.
And you know, I think it's very interesting. We go back to Edward Bernays, I believe his name, going back in the early part of the 1900s, a nephew of Sigmund Freud, was really the first, was really a genius in terms of propaganda and allowing and informing the masses to think or to create propaganda to get the masses to think in one specific way. For example, he was able to get women to start smoking cigarettes. He was able to get the American people to support a CIA overthrow in Guatemala so that the United Fruit Company could have its way down there. And I think this sort of thing is just going on and on and on. It continues to go on with the sort of propaganda that is being used by the media, probably by the people that control and own the Federal Reserve for sure. All right. Well, so Goldman Sachs is very interesting. You know, I knew J. Aaron and Company, then essentially Jeff Christian, who I've known and worked with J. Aaron, and when he was bought out, then went his own way when Goldman Sachs, or at some point in time, left Goldman Sachs and created his own firm. But Jeff is always, I think, on the other side of the libertarian view that you and I share. But so J. Aaron is still exists, but it's a part of, I guess it's part of Goldman Sachs now, and Goldman Sachs has picked up has picked up that game, I guess.
Yeah, J. Aaron is a London-based company. It's basically taken over the U.S.-based Goldman Sachs. But you know, the key for me is not so much that Goldman Sachs is often one that people focus on and are critical of, and it has played a key role. But I think there's a greater question in terms of, you know, the major American banks, the influence that they have over the New York Fed in particular in controlling things. I mean, the New York Fed has a permanent position on the Federal Open Market Committee that sets the interest rate policy, and the New York Fed also operates all of the Federal Reserve's interventions in the financial markets.
Right.
So the question is, you know, who really controls the Federal Reserve and what's going on here? And you know, the Fed hides the information of who the shareholders of the various regional banks are. And the New York Fed, we can't see that information. We really only have one source of information on that, and that was the book, The Secrets of the Federal Reserve. which was published several decades ago by Eustace Mullins. And unfortunately, it's the only source of information that we have on that. And in the addendum of the book, it shows that the banks, which have now been taken over, J.P. Morgan itself, or Chase Manhattan Bank, and its subsidiaries now that have been taken over, according to this table, hold about 38% of the New York Fed shares. And Citibank holds about 15%. So between these two banks, according to this table, which was Mullins says stated that he received from the New York Fed in 1983 through sources which are unknown. But between these two banks, we would have 53% of the control of the New York Fed shares, and thus, control of the New York Fed. So what it does is create, and maybe step back one more step here, is that J.P. Morgan Chase, or Chase Manhattan Bank, was really a Rockefeller bank. Morgan interests are Rothschild interests, and they combined through the J.P. Morgan Chase merger. And a Citibank is an old Rockefeller bank itself as well. So between, here we come back to these two groups
the
again.
Same groups, same families.
The Rockefellers and the Rothschilds, that it appears that they have outsized control of the U.S. monetary system. And I just hate that word conspiracy theory. It's just that we'd like to have some data here and have a better look at this. But this is the appearance: is that the same usual suspects are at the core of managing the financial system. And the question then becomes, in whose interest is the financial system structured and being managed?
Well, of course, we're told every day that it's in our interest. We, the taxpayers, have been encumbered with trillions of dollars of debt for our own good after the 2008-2009 debacle. So, I mean, it's very interesting. Eustace Mullins' book I've had, and actually I know that G. Edward Griffin used some of Mullins' work. Mullins was financed by Ezra Pound. His work, that is, his research, was financed by the poet Ezra Pound, who was thrown in jail for refusing or for objecting to the U.S. involvement in World War II, as I understand it.
Yeah.
And no doubt, because of a lot of this is the financial underpinnings of war, which really gives the military-industrial complex a free check, a blank check essentially to go out and continue to wage wars everywhere. All right, so what else do we want to talk about today?
Well, I think just closing out this discussion of the New York Fed is that if we look at the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the latest report, on page 34 of 37 of the U.S. bank derivatives positions, is that J.P. Morgan and Citibank are the only two U.S. banks with gold, silver derivatives positions, and they are large positions.
Ah, yes, they are.
Almost. So no other banks are holding precious metals derivative positions, and so it looks like that market is being maintained and controlled by these two banks, or influenced is perhaps a better choice of words. We don't know the extent of the control, but certainly they're the only two banks taking an interest in this market.
J.P. Morgan, I think, by far is the largest derivatives position, probably, but
yes.
Both of them together completely control the derivatives market. So you've got a monopoly, or at least an oligopoly here, that can very easily could coordinate, and I suspect do coordinate raids on the gold price at the right time. Just when gold should start to get out of hand and start to run on the upside, gets slammed down again, and people say, and then you hear CNBC guys coming on and say, gold should have gone up, but it didn't today, so therefore let's continue with the dollar.
Yeah.
Now,
overall, I think Ron Paul was pushing for an audit the Fed movement.
Yeah.
And I think that is what is essential now to clean things up and to move forward. We've got to see what's going on inside the Federal Reserve with its shareholder banks, and clean up the system. And it all goes back to, we have a system now which is being operated by the banks. I've gotten into discussions with a number of people, including Chris Powell of GATA, and Chris has done some really a yeoman's job in getting this information out day after day, tracking articles and publishing them on the market interventions and distortions that are happening. But really, these are not Treasury or central bank interventions. Like, this is not what Treasury or central banks do. Like, I mean, that's not the story. The story is that you have regulatory capture. And government and the central banks are basically, through a number of systems, including the revolving door, but they are basically controlled by the financial system. And so we have financial system and financial market participant interventions who are distorting the markets themselves. And back to the point about Ron Paul, we've got to have an audit of these central banks to find out what has happened. And to try to right the ship here, because it certainly has a terrible list on.
Interesting. The New York Sun-Times, I think it's called, a very small newspaper here in New York, and sometimes Chris Powell passes it along to the readers from GATA. And they had an editorial this last week suggesting that perhaps now, since Elizabeth Warren, the liberal senator from Massachusetts, is pushing for an audit of the Fed, that maybe Rand Paul will follow in his father's footsteps. What do you think the chances of that? Rand Paul supporting Elizabeth, Rand Paul supposedly from the right, working with Elizabeth Warren on the left to make anything like that happen?
Not likely, from what I've seen of Rand Paul.
He wants to be president.
Yeah, he's using the conventional path and approach to becoming president, and his views on things day to day seem to be changing. So, I wouldn't look for him in terms of doing something. When you look at the financial sector, they're the primary source of campaign donations, and I would think that he wouldn't think that would be a very good way to become president.
All of this is very much related. The monetary system, which is really an immoral system that allows those that have control of the printing press to steal from the rest of the country. It also allows the military-industrial complex to get get funded and to go wherever it wants to go and make tons of money by killing people and taking land and changing countries. It also has a lot to do, I think, with what we're talking about, the petrodollar, which has been really the way of keeping everything trading in dollars around the world, which is really what's happened with the oil, starting with the oil crisis in the early 70s when we went off the gold standard. Then we needed another standard, and it became the petro standard, essentially the petrodollar. To what extent, David, do you think all this stuff going on in the Middle East is related to that? Probably stuff going on in the Ukraine is related to energy?
Mm-hmm. I think it is. As it is right now with the U.S. consumption of oil and the European consumption of oil, they have inadequate oil consumption from within country, so they must buy it from out of country. And to get the importation of these real assets, they have to have other countries accepting their currency. And we can see now this ISIS creation, which is pretty clear that it was financed and created. The training went on in Jordan, trained by U.S. and U.K. forces. And John Boehner on the weekend now was saying in the interview, the Speaker of the House was saying that they're going to need boots on the ground to get ISIS, and this is what I've been waiting for, because ISIS, curiously enough, appeared right in the middle of some areas of large Iraqi oil reserves and a pipeline route from expected to be from Qatar through to Turkey up through Syria. And I think Boehner on the weekend in that ABC News interview was saying, we're going to need boots on the ground. I think he really should have said we need boots on the oil.
Yeah.
We need to stand on top of it and control it. And I think we would expect to see that if we're going to have a currency crisis, is that they are going to try to seize assets which they deem to be important. And this has been not invisible. It's been very visible that this currency crisis is coming for decades. And instead of reforming our system, we've just started on the path of warfare and asset seizure, and it's not sustainable, and it's not a good policy.
So we finance ISIS. ISIS stands on top of the oil, and now we go in and boots on the ground, boots on the oil, as you say, to get ISIS out, and then we can take over. It's divide and conquer sort of a mentality, it seems. It seems to be our modus operandi, NATO's modus operandi, divide and conquer. mix a lot of a liberal dose of propaganda in there to keep people off balance so they don't really know what's going on,
Yep.
and just plant confusion everywhere. It seems to be what's going on. But as we say, these things are all interrelated, and Singapore now has a physical gold exchange. Well, it will have soon on October 13th, I
Yeah.
think you said. How does that tie in?
Well, the world's going to physical, and it's going to cause ultimately a disruption of the paper markets in New York and London. And so we had the Shanghai Free Trade Zone market go live on September 18th, and now on October 13th, we have the Singapore physical gold exchange opening up, and we also have Dubai and had Moscow open last year. So we're going to see now vehicles for the acquisition and securing of bullion in these markets writ large, I think. And I think that it's going to have a material impact on the paper pricing structure that we are following right now.
Well, now I have to think, David, that our powers that be that would not really want to see Singapore go forward. Do you think we might start to see some, perhaps some sort of an Arab winter or something in Singapore? I mean, might we see some? I mean, we might see our propaganda, our CIA go in there and foment trouble and propaganda and try to overthrow the government of Singapore so we can get who we want in there.
Well, about 6 months ago, we actually saw a flare-up in Singapore when they announced this physical market was opening, and it was kind of a bit of a surprise because of how structured and orderly Singapore has been.
Yeah.
And then now here on the weekend we have the riots in Hong Kong starting up a week after the free trade zone gold exchange has opened, and there, looking at the volumes last week on the international board in the free trade zone, in any particular day they weren't over 1,000 kilograms of activity on the market, but there are those who view that activity on that market as perhaps being indicative of delivery of gold for oil, and that there may be countries now that are already doing a petrogold trade, but with quantums higher gold prices backing it, because they can see that there's going to be a destruction of the U.S. dollar and the Western currencies, and they don't want to hold those bonds, and they're willing to take the physical metal at a much lower price, or at a much higher price point. Much lower volumes in exchange for oil. So there is that discussion happening already, that we may be seeing this happen. And back in the late 60s, there was already a push for a gold-based exchange standard versus what is an unstable paper U.S. dollar. And the riots that we see in Hong Kong this past weekend, really, we saw those back in the 60s, in the late 60s, when Charles de Gaulle of France called for a gold-based currency system for trade. And, within a very short period of this, de Gaulle causing consternation in the West, they had explosion of these student riots in Paris. And there's literally just a couple of articles on the web about it, but it was within a month of the Bilderberg Club meeting, apparently, where Baron Edmund de Rothschild and James Jesus Angleton, who is a bit of an interesting guy from the U.S. CIA, they had gotten together and they were strategizing, and within 30 days these student riots started up, and de Gaulle in the end was gone within a year. He was out. And so it's a much more subtle approach to use than to go in and use weaponry and drop bombs, and I think it's the preferred method when you can use it. It's just cause destabilization of the people that are in to get them tossed out.
Sure, and what you do is you would appeal to the base instincts of the students who want to have a free this and a free that and not have to work for things. It's the whole big lie of socialism, that you can have something for nothing. It appeals to people. People will take you up on it. If you say you can have something, you don't have to work for it. Here's a free gift. People like that.
Yeah, I think that there are valid concerns in China in terms of the structure. I mean, the economy is a complete and utter bubble.
Sure.
They've created $15 trillion of private sector loans over the last 5 years, which is just a number that's so big it's hard to comprehend. So there are serious problems, and the central planning approach of the Shanghai government is not well received in Hong Kong, which is a much more democratically oriented or a market oriented economy. So I think there are valid grievances and concerns there, but
Sure.
these things have been bubbling away, and then they explode into the open. With this relationship in time to the opening of the free trade zone gold exchange.
Mm-hmm.
It could be coincidental, but I don't suspect that it is.
Mm-hmm. Could be very much related. Well, it makes all the sense in the world to me, David, that especially as we push, we deny China the right to protect their own sea lanes. We're pushing into Ukraine, trying to take over, essentially I think, to control Putin. Now I say we, NATO, the NATO alliances, the Western world, this propaganda machine that we're talking about is hard at work all around the world. And as we push sanctions on Russia, we're pushing them, I believe, into the arms of China. They don't have any choice but to try to trade. And you can all see, well, the dollar can be superfluous really if they can create their own trading system, their own confidence game. And a confidence game, just as ours once started out on the firm foundation of actual gold and silver as our money. There was a reason at one time to trust the dollar. Well, maybe those countries are going to pull something together out of economic necessity, not because they're more honest than we are necessarily, or I don't think so, but that just out of necessity they have to go back to the basics and build a strong economy on the foundation of a strong monetary system.
Yeah.
Because we've gotten rid of ours, we've trashed our monetary system. It's a lie, it's a joke, it's a horrible hoax. It's a system that's used to steal and rob and rape and pillage, literally and figuratively, in other nations all around the world. It is incredible. We talked to Daniel McAdams, who will be coming up next on this show, and I'm sure Daniel will be giving us the latest on all of the tricks that are being played by the Anglo-American Empire in convincing people that we're on the right track and keep supporting the United States government and NATO and everything. It's just really it's very, very sad. But so where does this leave us? I mean, this is the world. It's a messed up world that we live in.
Yeah.
What are we to do about it, David?
Well, it's very, very difficult to say, Jay. It just keeps getting more and more intense and more chaotic. I saw David Cameron speaking in the UN last week and saying that nonviolent extremists had to be controlled and they had to be prevented from saying things. And you can see this is moving more and more desperate on the part of the Western governments. They're making, on their face, just more and more specious claims in terms of what is needed and what is right and what is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And the world knows. I mean, they know of the creation of ISIS and what is going on and the destabilization of the currencies and the bubble economy that's been created by the West. And the rest of the world is moving in a different direction. And there seems to be this kind of a scramble on the side to keep the old system going, and it's not going to be successful. So I would just say plan for chaos, and that's all I can say. I can't really give any more advice or any other suggestions because it's just very difficult to know given every few days now there's something major popping up, and nobody knows where this goes.
Nobody knows where this goes, and I think the way most people cope with this is just simply not to think about it, or to deny it, or to not to plan for it. And I guess maybe if that makes you happier, you can go that route. But when they like to say that fecal matter hits the rotary oscillator, you might be happy if you've got some shelter or some way to try to protect yourself and your family. Certainly, we always talk about gold and silver as an asset to hold in lieu of a dollar that is becoming increasing. Well, it really is worthless already. And I think also, David, one of the main things to do is to have friends and family and people that you can work with and trust with, because if the system breaks down, you want to have some place to go and some people you can trust and form a network for the purpose of survival, really.
Yeah, throughout history, people have turned to gold and silver to protect themselves in times of disruption, and it happened in the Second World War. It's happened over and over. The people that got out of Vietnam were the boat people that got out of Vietnam were the ones who held gold. Mm-hmm. And it's just something that is innately appears to be in the DNA of humanity across the globe, and you just can't erase it by government dictate and by imposition of speculative, collapse-prone monetary systems.
No, you certainly can't fool Mother Nature, not forever. Our governments have been doing it for a long time on the monetary front, and I think on the geopolitical front as well. I want to thank you again, David, for being with us once again, and I look forward to talking to you again next week.
Thank you, Jay.